Good morning and thanks for joining us for this Share the Platform interview. I'm Bouris. I'm the Executive Chairman of Yellow Brick Road and I'm Chairman of a company called Mentored. And today I'm joined by Abdullahi Alim. Now, Abdullahi is an entrepreneur, that's probably understating it, and is a leader of the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers program. Abdullahi, welcome, and how are you, mate?
Mark, so good to see you. Good afternoon. How are things on your side?
Very good. Beautiful winter's day, but I'm sure that's a beautiful summer's day where you are right now in Switzerland, yes?
It is. It's so good to be here.
First and foremost, I'm absolutely intrigued. Your name, Abdullahi, can you tell me something about that name? Just the name.
Yes. Exactly. So I think for me, I always like to define what the meaning is to my name. And my name itself means servant of a higher power. And I think for me, it has such depth because I always find that the best version of myself comes out when I'm able to tap into that, when I'm able to submit myself to whatever that calling suggests. And so for me, it's a constant case every single morning of trying to figure out what is life trying to suggest to me, what is the universe trying to communicate to me, and trying to follow that direction as well.
That's quite a mature position to be in for someone of your, relatively speaking, younger years, in your late 20s. I'm not suggesting for a moment you do not have a lot of experience. You have a lot of academic qualifications as well. But that concept of being wanting and willing and having the skills to help people, to me, is one of the most exciting things I've heard in the last 6 months that since we've been suffering this so-called, the pandemic, okay? Yeah. So to have someone like you, someone in such a position of influence and power to some extent, talking about helping people is extraordinary and is very, very important. Can you tell me specifically, though, who do you like to help?
Yeah. And maybe just even to tie it back to the pandemic, I don't know if this has been the case for you, Mark, but this last set of months has been such a massive moment of reflection for me. It's been a space of introspection. Things have, slowed down for me, much like everyone else in the world. And again, it's going back to that formative for me. Like, what is it that I want to do with my life? What is it that I want to do? And I think much of that kind of dates back to my own formative experiences too. I'm from Western Australia. I'm a child of public housing. I went to a low-income school, and I think it's amazing to see that I've been able to come as far as I have. But I also know that I'm the exception. My experience is certainly not the norm, and I think for me, my desire to help create change and help support people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds really comes from my own lived experience and trying to make sure that it's the norm, not the exception.
I've actually experienced exactly what you're talking about because I grew up and I came from a migrant family, exactly the same. Probably most people wouldn't think so by looking at me today or knowing about me today, but that's where I came from. And a lot of people think that I grew up with a chip on my shoulders. Actually, I just wanted to help people, literally want to help people. How do you sort of get around that concept that some people out there would have as a chip on the shoulder, as opposed to just being positive like you're being now and wanting to actually do something and actually putting it into action, real life stuff? And what's that bridge? Was it your parents? Is it your faith, your beliefs, or is it the people who surrounded you? What is it?
I mean, it's very much driven by my Islamic faith, and I'm very proud of that. But I also have to say, I think the way in which you go from, being bogged down by just the scale of challenges that surround you to being able to actually do something is, I always say, you have to give yourself the privilege to dream. My experience, again, like even just in the preparation for this conversation, I thought back to where I was 10 years ago, for example. This was when I was in, first year out of high school. And, I think maybe what was lacking was I didn't necessarily have that exposure. I didn't necessarily see a track record of saying, if you're able to do this, if you're able to combine it with this is how you could amount to, this is where you could go in life. And I think the difference between being bogged down and really being able to do something about that, I think that very, very first step is giving yourself that privilege, enjoying that privilege to actually dream. Don't be too scared of it. Don't be too overwhelmed by it. Don't think it's too far out of your periphery. Yes, there are legitimate challenges that you'll experience, but giving yourself that luxury just to dream, I think, is always that first point that creates that ripple effect.
I'm hoping there's a lot of people watching this and listening to what you just said. And I listened to it intently. And I wonder what you would say to, let's say, a young Indigenous boy or girl in Australia, perhaps living in a remote area, who hopefully they can watch this. How important is it for them to dream? And how do they go about this process of dreaming? I mean, what is it? How did you do it?
God. I think specifically for Indigenous Australians, I mean, yeah, I think just your very, I mean, especially if you're in the rural pockets of this country, I think just your very survival is a miracle on its own. The fact that, you know, you come from such a legacy of survival, of innovation, you come from the longest standing tradition and culture in the world on recorded history, I think tells you come with a track record of being able to innovate, being able to survive and withstand some of the worst kind of forms of oppression. So I think just your very survival, acknowledge the power in that. And also know that there is such power in you being able to take more and more of those steps forward. And of course, there will be power coming against you and the kind of challenges that you might experience. But just know that your very existence is a miracle. Anything you take forward beyond that would really reap dividends for yourself and for your communities, to be honest, in ways that you couldn't even imagine. I'm very disheartened, Mark, to be honest, to say this, but also match this with just the realistic state of where most Indigenous Australians find themselves today. I think when we look at, you know, the new economy and, you know, the promises of technology, I think it's super, super sad that, and maybe my stats need some revision because it's been some years since I checked, but I think up until 2017, 2018, we had 11 Indigenous Australians graduating each year with a computer science degree or with an ICT degree. I mean, that is abysmal. You know, as much as we talk about the new economy being, you know, the direction of the future, it's innovative, it has promises of, you know, blah, 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 blah. If it's continuing to perpetuate the very old structures, the very forms of exclusion in today's economy, in historical economies of the past, I mean, that to me, I think is abysmal. So I think for those of us who are watching this, who maybe don't identify as Indigenous Australians, but maybe work in the startup ecosystem, I think commit to it as well. Commit to being the ally as well to make sure that 11 isn't the number that continues to persist. Because at that rate, we're really not going to tackle the disadvantage.
Is part of the problem, you talked about startups, is part of the problem that all the encouragement for startups and all the money for startups and all the mentoring for startups, it all sort of occurs in the city environments. Is that part of the problem? And remote people are removed from that?
Oh, 100%. And I think I'd go even further. I think it's also my experience as well. It was very much centered around a white middle upper class, almost like hipster caricature. I mean, unless you were part of that in today's modern startup ecosystem, it's very hard for investors. It's very hard for other players in the ecosystem to recognize you're the same level of talent as everybody else they've seen in the past. So I think it disproportionately disadvantages communities of color, Black communities, our Black Indigenous Australians, of course, as well. But of course, rural pockets too as well. So I think I remember when going back to even like a few years ago when, you know, a lot of the startup ecosystem was really centered around trying to create inclusive spaces for white women. And that really becoming the definition of diversity at the expense of every other marginalized group. And I put this suggestion forward to one of like the key players, in fact, in Sydney. I said to him, have you thought about maybe other groups to kind of create a more inclusive umbrella, the Indigenous Australians, the migrant Australians, the refugees more specifically as well? How do you incorporate those voices? And he said, we can only do one at a time. And I think at that very slow pace that we're currently tracking towards of trying to create inclusive spaces, basically in tomorrow's economy, I think with this kind of very minimalist thinking, that lacks nuance, that lacks the complexities of different experiences of Australians. I think, at this space, we're not going to tackle the disadvantage that we see. But unless more and more people come into the startup space recognizing we are building tomorrow's economy, and who designs that, who benefits from that will literally be the ways in which our societies will be equitable in tomorrow's world. Unless people really realize that and are willing to put that kind of structural power behind those kind of efforts, I think we're still going to see 11 Indigenous Australians graduating each year. We're still going to see people dropping out of the startup ecosystem thinking this isn't for me. And each person that drops out is one less invention for this country. It's one less startup for this country. It's one less dollar of foreign direct investment that could have gone to this startup. I think more people need to see it from that systemic lens.
And you just said something very interesting there. And I just want to underline this because I think it's important for that person that I just underlined, that person who I drew the vignette of, who may be in a remote area. If you're able to survive poverty, lack of privilege, just lack of understanding, racism generally, if you're one of those people and you can survive that, you actually have some incredibly strong tools to be able to do well if you're given a platform to do it. So I would ask you, Abdullahi, if you were in government today, because you're in policy, you're a policy person. I mean, you may be young, but you're nonetheless a policy person. Do you think it's better that we take the infrastructure that is mentoring, IT, assistance, etc., like that sort of stuff you can experience in a hub as a startup? Do we take it to the regions, or do we bring those people who are interested back into the city and accommodate them here into the hub? In other words, do we take the hub out? Do we distribute it out? Or do we bring those people who are interested into the hubs here in Sydney? Does government pay for this? What would you see, out or back in?
I mean, I think definitely government has the mandate to do that, right? If you're the largest institution in driving, again, like today's economy, tomorrow's economy, like that's your mandate, it definitely has to fall under your kind of protection. I think it's a case of doing both. I think there has to be that flow of talent from rural communities to urban zones too. But I think at the same time, urban kind of resources need to go into rural spaces to kind of prop that up too. So I think I actually think it has to be a bit of both. And I think we need to intentionally put a lot more in the outer suburbs, in the rural parts of this country, so that you can create some level of equilibrium. Because again, we cannot call this an innovative sector if it only privileges a certain amount of people. There is nothing innovative about reinforcing historical exclusions.
That's interesting. I chaired the federal government's task force on digitisation of business in Australia, and we had a lot of objectives in our terms of reference. And you know what, I wish I'd have spoken to you about this then, because digitisation is what we're talking about, really. I mean, having the ability to use digitisation to build tech and or startup. We never really talked about remote people who live in remote areas, or the opportunity that those people in those remote areas don't get. And what's important, you just raised a really important thing. Let's be selfish for a moment. Let's the white, upper class Australians, someone who I may well be seen as representing, or the government, etc. Let's be selfish for a moment. As you just said, there could be some amazing inventions here which help our country. Even if we looked at it from just a purely selfish point of view, self-centered point of view, as opposed to being proper in our approach to everybody having equal rights, as opposed to that. If they're selfishly thinking about themselves, the government and the policymakers, they should see the opportunity on its own, just bare opportunity by itself. And then maybe hopefully they could rise to the occasion and start to think of equality and what you call the new normal. The new normal is a better form of humanity to me. And I'm hoping this is going to come out of this coronavirus. At least one good thing could come out of coronavirus. That's a better form of humanity. And that is how we think about people, which is the reason, by the way, why I agreed to do this. I would not ordinarily be invited to these things, nor do I normally think about this. It doesn't normally come into my thought ambit. But this is an opportunity for me to talk to someone like you. I see this as a great privilege to talk to you, to be frank with you, and have this sort of discussion online to whatever the audience is. I think that, if that task force was formed today, one of my recommendations to the government, to the Treasurer from the task force, would be exactly what you just said, a combination of sponsorship of those who are interested back into the hubs in the city areas or in the metropolitan areas, and as equally the distribution of smaller versions of the hub, even if it's some sort of travelling van that goes around and sits around and tutors and teaches young people what they need to learn about. I would like, I want to just talk a little bit about you, if you don't mind. What is right now, what's your main business objective? Where are you at? We're talking about the World Economic Forum. What are you doing in the World Economic Forum right now?
Yeah, so I work with a network called the Global Shapers Community. And essentially the idea is it's a network of about 13,000 young people in 150 countries. And the idea is to be able to give them opportunities to create more impact in their own lines of work, whatever that looks like, But also, I think at the very same time, and I think this is an implicit objective too, is really to be able to identify the next generation, the next cohort of industry leaders, public leaders, the next heads of civil society organizations 20 years in advance. So I work with people who are my age for the most part. And so I think of examples of people, based in, let's say, in Nigeria, who are leading now what could, I think, amount to like the next unicorn, the next billion-dollar startup on the continent, or somebody who works on combating a very, very, very complex, let's say, social issue in a very rural part of, let's say, a country like Egypt, and everything in between. And so I think it gives me the great luxury to be able to see trends, to be able to see where we're heading towards as a global economy, as a global society. And yeah, I think there's a lot to be disheartened by. And I think the coronavirus, unfortunately, kind of gives you examples of that every single day. But I think I have to also just take stock and appreciate the fact that I also see a lot to be thankful for, to be grateful for. And yeah, I have to say the network that we run is also a lot more inclusive and representative of the world than I think most power spaces. So if that can be replicated in the power spaces of tomorrow at that same trend, then it's promising.
And are you identifying such people? I mean, because one of the things that worries me, particularly with this coronavirus or this period of change, I mean, forget about coronavirus, we're in a period of change, the way I see it. One of the things that worries me is that the rich and the powerful are going to get more powerful and more rich, or definitely more powerful. We are going to get convergence, and that is everything's going to converge into those big global organizations, and to the detriment of all the smaller startups. And the bigger organizations, they see a valuable startup, they're just going to go and buy it, and take it over, take control of it, and direct, either smother it and or direct it into the direction they want to take it themselves under their own ownership. Do you see that is that a problem for the World Economic Forum? I mean, in your role, do you worry about that sort of stuff?
I mean, I do. I definitely do. I think we need far more robust antitrust laws, because I think the more of these crises that we have, the more of these recessions that we've had. And again, like I have to say, today's young people, I think they're one of the first generations of millennials to live through two global recessions, two global economic downturns during their formative years. So that means it's that much harder to get into your first job, that much harder to negotiate for that wage increase, that much harder for you to even develop, I would say, the mental well-being that comes from having that kind of structure in your formative years, the job, the circle that comes with that, so on and so forth. I think it's really sad to say this, but I mean, I was just looking at the stats from the US, for example. The stock market is at an all-time high. Asset prices, real estate prices at an all-time high. But more layoffs than ever before, more SMEs are closing than ever before. I think one very damning statistic that I came across was that I think in the last week, 1.1 million people in the US alone applied for unemployment benefits, which was more than even the height of the Great Depression. Now, this is in the most advanced economy in the world, so you could only imagine what's happening elsewhere. I think Australia is somewhat a bit more lucky because we haven't been as implicated by the pandemic. But honestly, you'll see similarly abysmal cases in Europe, certainly in the global south as well. And yeah, I think that's going to be one of the biggest questions and fights of our generation, which is the big power play between big business and government, which will be representative of trying to create a space where there aren't too many monopolies, where it's a space where even SMEs can continue to compete. Because like you said, the more we see of these recessions, the more cases of them just being able to buy out ventures that aren't necessarily thriving at the rates that they possibly could. And yeah, you'll see more of these monopolies and just less of an equitable economy, less of an equitable world, which because again has so many ramifications.
It does, and I mean, what worries me is that we see sort of splinter revolutions sort of being conducted around the world. Not so much here in Australia, but certainly in the US and other places. But they all seem to be, to some extent, a little bit ineffectual. But most of them rely upon platforms, but the platforms are owned by, we know who the platforms are owned, and they're the people I'm worried about are going to get more powerful, which, that's fine, but it's up to governments to control and manage that. I mean, you can't blame these platforms for trying to get bigger and bigger and bigger. I get it. But at the same time, government's got to recognise these things and have got to step up and make sure that we don't get put in a position where the tail starts to wag the dog. And and it's not so much I'm worried about government. I'm more worried about little people like I was when I was 20 years of age, and I was lucky, but who got an opportunity to do something, and which has led now to my opportunity, for example, to interview you. And people like you've had opportunities, but what I'm worried about is those little 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds who come from similar environments to what you'll come from, or the next generation of Abdullahi comes from, and do they get the same chances that you get and that I got? I got these opportunities 40 odd years ago. You're getting these opportunities today. The 2- and 3-year-olds who are coming from the not so great environments today, will they get the same opportunities we got, or are they going to be pretty much stood over and stood on? I mean, we keep thinking this time is a time of much more equality and much more recognition of everybody being the same. I wonder whether or not, given the way business is going, that's not going to be the case in actual fact. We're just going to pay lip service to what you're talking about. I'm worried about that. Hopefully the World Economic Forum is, and I think from what you're saying is you're concerned about this. And we rely on people like you, Abdullahi. I hate to put too much pressure on you, but we rely on people like you to actually make this happen, because it's not going to be me. It's not my game. I don't hold that sort of ability to build that sort of initiative. But we need people like you, or a young man from Western Australia, now in Switzerland, working for World Economic Forum, who is passionate and actually has experiences and understands this. So how do you feel about that obligation?
I take it on. Honestly, I take it on, and I take it on with great stride. I think you hit the nail on the head. Let me just say one quick thing as well. 2008 financial crisis, what came from that? You got Occupy Wall Street, you had the Arab Spring, you had a lot of youth-led movements run by young people who were just highly, highly disenfranchised. Today's youth movements that we see today, things like Greta's Fridays for the Future, some of these kids in the US who are fighting against gun violence, for example. These teenagers, these teenage change makers that we'll see a lot more of, and who are a lot more emboldened, they're literally the children of the 2008 financial crisis. So today, I'm more worried at the fact that we're going into another economic downturn, much worse than 2008. I'm worried about the kind of inequities it's going to create. I'm worried about the ways in which it'll force young people to basically take on this social justice agenda, which really should be the mandate of government, the responsibilities of government to create these kind of equitable spaces. It really, really does worry me. But I think, I also just have more and more hope that people are waking up and beginning to realize that, it really, like you said, it takes every single person taking on that mandate to say, I expect this. I want to realize this. I expect this of my government. I need to realize this. I, as an employee of this company, expect my employer to operate in this way. I'm going to also make efforts to kind of see it go in that direction. The more and more people mobilize, and the more we see that organized citizenry, I think the more likely we are to create that change. But otherwise, like we said before, big tech companies, for example, growing more and more influential. And unfortunately, I think they'll only create negative implications for the world at large.
Well, this is an interview with Abdullahi, Alim. So I want to leave you with the last word. What would you like to say to all those people who are listening to us today on this platform? Share the platform. What's the one thing you want to leave us with?
I think share the platform is, I think for the most part, for Black Australians, whether that be Indigenous Australians, those who are migrant communities, as well as people of color. And my thing to you is, nobody is going to give you your rights. Nobody gave me mine. So you need to almost kind of muster up, even if it's one of those fake it until you make it situations, you need to muster up as much confidence and self-belief, because you will have to weather through a lot more than the average person to get to where you want. But what it also means is that you get to places knowing that you are almost over-prepared and you're able to really reap the benefits of it. Because there are so many examples of young people that I work with as well who have amazing opportunities that come to them, but they weren't simply prepared. So constantly think, constantly believe in yourself that you're able to manifest the best versions of yourself. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily grind. Do not be ignorant to the challenges that you face. Acknowledge it, because not acknowledging it, I think, creates kind of mental health issues down the line as well. But just, take stride in the fact that you can definitely do it. You doing it creates generational ripples as well. And I'm really, really excited because we are the next generation of Australia. So the more emboldened we become, the more we recognize our talents, the more we step up into our own lives, I think the more the country steps up too. So I think everybody benefits. So I hope you will join me in that kind of journey of self-discovery too, because it's done wonders for me so far.
Bravo, bravo, and bravo, Abdullahi Alim. And it's been a great pleasure, a great opportunity, and a great pleasure for me to talk to you today.
Likewise.
I just think, that sort of outro to this discussion gives me goosebumps to think that it's a man in his late 20s who is actually putting it out there. That's just sort of shows the type of maturity that I expect from our senior politicians, which sadly we don't always get. But I want to say thank you very much. For more information about Share the Platform campaign and see these interviews, just head over to sharetheplatform.com. Abdullahi, wonderful. Thanks very much. Bravo.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.